Hey, what do you and I both have in common? Correct. We both love listening to the sound of my beautiful voice. So, without further ado, I am very happy to be once again waffling on about sodium ions and all that jazz. Welcome to You Gotta Be Kidding Me, episode 10, Cortical Collecting Duct. We're almost there, so hang in there. So, we've done all this bit, and we're now kind of at the last stage here. We're looking at the cortical kind of side first, and obviously there's going to be a video later on at the medullary side. Importantly to note that the urine here is called, the filtrate here is now called urine. So that kind of shows you that we're at the end of our emotional roller coaster of the nephron. All right, overview. So as we said, the filtrate is called urine, and a lot of the solutes have been reabsorbed, so they've been taken out. So that means your urine is now isotonic, so meaning either having the same amount of sodium as the plasma or hypotonic, basically less solute relative to the plasma because a lot of it has already been taken out and dumped back into the plasma. Now, in a situation where you have ADH, which is high, now ADH is the hormone that is responsible for absorbing water. So if you had this hypothetical situation where ADH is high and your hormone for absorbing salt, which is called aldosterone, is low, what does that mean? You're not reabsorbing as much salt, okay, but you are reabsorbing a lot more water. So a lot more salt is staying into the kind of urine or the filtrate, but more water is being taken out. So in that situation, our urine can become hypertonic, i.e., the urine can have more salt in it than the plasma. That's because we're not enabling salt to be reabsorbed, but we are enabling water to be reabsorbed. That's like a hypothetical situation. Okay, there are three types of cells in your cortical collecting duct. And your first one is called principal cells. These guys are responsible, little typo there, but these guys are responsible for the fine tuning of sodium. And this is in response, these guys respond to a hormone called aldosterone. Aldosterone is made by your RAS pathway, made by angiotensin 2 and all that lovely stuff. Okay, your channels. You're going to have one called ENaC and ROMK. ROMK you've heard about in the thick ascending limb. ENaC you've probably heard me mention before as well. So ENaC takes up sodium. This is where the typo was. ROMK dumps potassium into the urine. The principal cells also respond to anti-diuretic hormone. Now remember, diuresis means to dilute urine, which means adding water to our urine. So if we're doing the anti of that, we're reabsorbing water. So ADH is a hormone that says, yo, I'm dehydrated, let's take up some more water. And that is done by your principal cells, very important cells in terms of water regulation. Okay, you've got two other cells, and these come under the subcategory of intercalating cells. What do intercalating cells do? They are responsible for the acid-base balance. So your kidney can kind of fine-tune that as well. And this is done by the intercalating cells. And it's pretty neat because they follow like a little mnemonic kind of thing. So there's two cells. There's one called the alpha cells, and conveniently, the alpha cells stands for acidic urine. So A is for acidic urine. So these guys make your urine acidic. So these guys dump H plus into the lumen in exchange for K plus. If you've been paying attention to the previous videos, and like apologies if you haven't because I drone on, but anyways, that's a you problem. If you've been paying attention, you will see that a lot of the time, if K plus is low, we end up somehow with metabolic alkalosis. We'll explain that in more detail, but it's these guys that are responsible for this. Essentially, they're trying to take up more K plus, but I've likened it to a deal with the devil. In order to take up K plus, you're like, okay, I'll let you have some extra K plus to compensate for low hyperkalaemia. But in order to do that, I'll have to dump H plus into your urine and therefore cause metabolic alkalosis, H2,3, into your plasma. So it's not a great situation. And our beta intercalating cells, they also follow this nice little rule thingy. B is for basic urine. So a small amount of sodium reabsorption also occurs here. But the main thing that these guys do is they dump bicarbonate into the urine. Okay, so far so good. Right. We said the principal cells, what was their job again? Remind me. these guys do the fine-tuning of sodium balance in response to aldosterone. So we're going to be looking at these in more detail now. Okay. Oops. Sorry about that. My headphones became loose. Right. So, principal cells, and they respond to aldosterone, and the channels are via ENaC, ROMK, and again, I made that same typo again, and they reabsorb water in response to ADH. So you should be quite comfortable with knowing these kind of 3 bullet points. Let's zoom in to our epithelial cell. On your left side here, you have your lumen. Stuff here ends up in your urine. And on this side, you have your basolateral side where the blood is flowing. Okay, so aldosterone. What did we say was aldosterone? Okay, we said it was something to do with salt, right? Correct. So in your RAS system, renin, angiotensin, aldosterone, so this is your second A in RAS. If basically your blood pressure is low, your body will activate the RAS system. Angiotensin 2 will then will basically cause aldosterone to be produced. So aldosterone comes along and activates the principal cells to transcribe 2 channels. Also, aldosterone is made if K plus is too high. We'll see why. So what are the 2 channels that aldosterone transcribes? So aldosterone is coming in our blood in response to low circulating blood pressure. So the first channel it's going to transcribe, so it's going to come along to this epithelial cell and be like, yo, okay, we need to fix this low sodium or low blood pressure. Let's fix this. So first, it's going to start transcribing some optional, ion channels. So the first one it's going to transcribe is called ENaC, our friend. And another one it's going to transcribe is one called ROMK, renal outer medullary K plus channel. Okay, so basically it dumps K plus back into the lumen. Now, you also saw this in your thick ascending limb. So it's going to transcribe this into the cell in response to aldosterone. And these kind of transporters are like optional, so they don't have to be in the lumen, but in response to aldosterone, they'll be transcribed. And then they'll embed themselves in the lumen. So hooray, we've now got 2 extra channels in the lumen. So ENaC takes in any extra sodium from the urine and is going to take it into the blood. And ROMK is going to dump K plus out into the urine. The thing about ENaC and ROMK is that although they're 2 separate channels, there's some strange physiology that basically means they act as a co-transporter. So every time you take a sodium in, you dump a K plus out. These 2 are basically kind of coupled in that sense. Okay, also it's going to transcribe a 3rd type of channel, which is your friend, your basolateral Na plus K plus antiporter. This is basically on all of those, well, a lot of those kidney cells. And this is going to drive your secondary active transport. So this is quite an important one. You know what it does. Okay, as we said, basically ENaC and ROMK work together nicely, essentially acting as an antiporter. Now, there's a little bit of waffle if you're interested, but if you want to understand it. So the ENaC has an equilibrium voltage of plus 60 millivolts, and the ROMK, it's a potassium channel. Remember, all potassium channels have this thing minus 90 millivolts. So this is basically explaining how these guys work together. It's a low yield point, but for completeness, I'm talking about it. So when sodium enters, what's going to happen? You're going to get a depolarization of this membrane. And remember, sodium is positive, so now you get an entry of positive ions, which means your membrane voltage is going to become more positive, which means it will become further away from this minus 90 millivolts. Very nice. The ROMK is not happy. It's like, why are you all running away from me? Come back, right? So the ROMK tries to counteract this by trying to act up as well. Okay, so this is gonna, in response to try and bring down the equilibrium voltage, it will pump out K plus. Pumping out a positive ion will lead towards the membrane becoming negative, right? Because we're getting it away from the membrane, and therefore they work together. So that wasn't too bad, the waffle. Right, now we can get rid of it. Essentially, all you have to know, and you do have to know this, these two are married, okay? Now, there's your other hormone that also acts on your principal cells and no other kind of cells in your cortical connecting duct. So this is important here as well. And it's called anti-diuretic hormone, ADH. So we said diuresis means dilute urine. So dilute urine means putting water in your urine. So anti-diuretic hormone, what's that going to do? That is going to make your urine less dilute, i.e. absorb water from your urine. And why might you have that? When are you going to try and reabsorb water from your urine? When you are probably dehydrated. So basolaterally, there's always, these are like kind of fixed, glued in. Basolaterally, there's these channels, aquaporins 3s and 4s. So two types of aquaporins. Remember, aquaporins are your water channels. And these are your permanent ones, as I said. Now, in response to being dehydrated, your pituitary gland is going to secrete ADH. Now, just a little bit more waffle on that. What exactly happens here? So, in terms of, again, you have to know this bit as well because it might be SBAable. In your pituitary gland, there's some nuclei. Now, what is a nuclei? It's not like a nucleus of a cell. When you're talking about neurology, when lots of nerves come together, that's called a nucleus. So, like lots of axons, basically. So, there's a nuclei in the brain, so a region in the brain called the paraventricular and supraoptic hypothalamic nuclei. So what does that mean? It's in the hypothalamus, which is a part of the brain. Supraoptic means it's kind of above the eye bit in your brain. And so there's paraventricular above the ventricle or next to the ventricles. So it seems like a techie word, but actually it's not too bad. So these guys, they live in the pituitary gland. So in the pituitary gland, you have these nuclei, so these bundles of nerves that project into the pituitary gland. Now, that's your kind of hormonal center in your head, in your brain. Now, these have central osmoreceptors, and the central osmoreceptors, basically, they sense low water. So when the central osmoreceptors sense low water, and that might either be through increased osmolality, so if your blood is less dilute, that means your solutes are going to basically be like higher concentrated, so that means less water. Or if your blood pressure decreases a lot, your osmoreceptors will be activated. They'll be like, okay, let's fix this. These nuclei, these nerves become activated, then they project into the pituitary gland, and they tell the pituitary gland to release ADH. Okay, so in response to dehydration, by the way, you need to know all of that. In response to dehydration, you get ADH being circulated now all the way. Imagine this is the brain coming all the way down the circulation. Now we've got into the kidney. And ADH is going to bind to a basolateral receptor called the V2 receptor. So this is your V2 receptor, and it's a G protein coupled receptor, and it's type A. And this is going to, so ADH binds on this, and then it's going to signal to something called adenylate cyclase, which you should be familiar with. That increases a thing called cyclic AMP, which is your intracellular messenger. And this increase in cyclic AMP due to ADH activating the V2 receptor on the basolateral membrane is going to cause insertion of like these optional aquaporins into your luminal membrane. So you get these things called aquaporin 2s, and you have to know the numbers. I know it's a pain to know, but it's not about 2, 3, 4. Aquaporin 2s are going to get inserted because of this increase in cyclic AMP into the luminal membrane. So now imagine I'm a water molecule in the urine. Hooray! There's now a channel for me to move. Remember, water can't move if there's no channels for it. So water is going to move now and can exit via the permanent basolateral aquaporin 3s and 4s. So that's what ADH does. Now, Obviously, your osmolality can change kind of rapidly for various reasons. So ADH is adapted to that, and it has a half-life of 14 minutes. What that means is that if you need to rapidly turn off or on your signal, then you can do so. Like ADH from a few hours ago won't still be acting, so you can respond to it kind of quickly. All right, let's talk about diuretics now. So diuretics. Remember, diuretics, what do? Dilute urine, which means they decrease sodium and water reabsorption, basically getting more water into the urine, into your wee, so watery wee. The one that acts, well, there's three that act here on the principal cells. The first one, and this is the one, if you're going to learn any of them, this is the one that you need to know. It's called spironolactone. So this, we've said that aldosterone increases the mRNA transcription of ENaC and ROMK. So aldosterone is going to transcribe these two. Spironolactone comes along and puts a big fat X through these, and it's like no transcription for you. So the thing with ENaC is that if ENaC isn't constantly synthesized, then what happens is there's a protein called ubiquitin, and that kind of coats this ENaC, and then the ubiquitin coated ENaC gets degraded by something called endosomes. So essentially, if ENaC isn't constantly transcribed, it's going to get eventually degraded. Therefore, if you stop the transcription of ENaC via spironolactone, it's going to get degraded. ENaC is not going to work. So what we're saying is spironolactone essentially stops ENaC from working. I've said that. So that's why spironolactone is effective. Spironolactone has a short half-life of 10 minutes, which means that it quickly gets metabolized into something. I'm not going to bother to pronounce that. Cameron, maybe? However, this has a half-life of 16 hours, so it's an active metabolite. Basically, it can still kind of work similar to spironolactone. So therefore, spironolactone is a slow onset action, which is important, you need to know. Okay, a few kind of side effects. It can cause menstrual disorders, gynecomastia, which is basically when males develop kind of breast tissue, and testicular atrophy. So how are we going to remember these symptoms? Well, these side effects, they're kind of all to do with kind of like hormonal reproductive stuff, right? So if you think of androgens, that's kind of how you remember spironolactone. And that's basically because spironolactone is quite similar sometimes to the androgen receptor, which means the androgen receptor is kind of your hormone receptor. So basically, spironolactone can cause these sorts of problems. There's an alternative called eplerenone, yeah, that. And this is more specific to the mineralocorticoid receptor. What's mineralocorticoid? Pause. So, aldosterone is a mineralocorticoid. The receptor it binds to on the basolateral membrane is called the mineralocorticoid receptor. So this eplerenone thing is more specific to the aldosterone receptor. Therefore, it's not going to act as much on the androgen receptors. Therefore, it's not going to cause these kind of nasty symptoms as much. Although this drug here, unlike spironolactone, it doesn't have active metabolites. So obviously, it lasts for a short amount of time. Okay, that's spironolactone kind of done. There's two more diuretics that act on the cortical collecting duct, and luckily they're all kind of here. So all your diuretic stuff you just worry about here. So there's one called amiloride, and third one is called Triamterene. I'm really bad at pronouncing stuff. These guys are not very strong diuretics. For example, compared to furosemide, which is able to dump out a lot of the sodium. This is relatively weak.
I'm too weak.
So there we go. Now these also, what they're going to do is they are going to decrease. Basically, remember we said these two are married. Okay, so if you stop one, you're going to stop the other, basically. So you're going to stop ROMK dumping out K plus back into the lumen. And also, I don't really know how this works, and you don't need to know how this works either. These two drugs cause a decrease in magnesium excretion, so they can lead to high magnesium in the blood and also high potassium in the blood as well. So these two drugs, they undergo hydroxylation in the liver and a process called sulfuric esterification. What that means is basically they're converted and they have low bioavailability, which means they're not readily available because they're converted into a different form. And your dosage is 50 milligrams once a day, which is something you have to know. Now, all three of these drugs, so spironolactone as well, as we said, it's going to stop ROMK because these two are married. So if you're stopping ENaC, you're also going to stop your ROMK channels. So you're going to stop K plus being dumped out into the lumen, into the urine, basically. So most of the drugs before this would lead to K plus loss. Now, why was this? Most, like for example, if you take furosemide, which acts where? In the loop of Henle. Now that's going to stop sodium uptake. Now your kidney is like, okay, I'm low on sodium, let me take up more sodium. And the bit downstream of that is your cortical collecting duct here. So it will, your kidney will be like, okay, let's make some more ENaC and take up more sodium. This is, for example, with furosemide. And in response to furosemide, because ENaC is now working overtime to kind of compensate, it's going to be dumping more K plus into the lumen because these two are married, so they have the same function. When one works, the other one works. Therefore, drugs that come before the cortical collecting duct lead to K plus loss. However, if you target this itself, then you're going to be inhibiting the ROMK thing, so you won't get a loss of K plus into the urine. So this can actually kind of be disadvantages as well. So these three drugs, amiloride, triamterene, and spironolactone, because they can stop ROMK from working, you should understand why now. You're not going to get as much K plus being dumped into the urine, which means you're going to get more K plus in your blood. This can cause something called hyperkalaemia, and your symptoms here, you have to know these, are vomiting, cramps, weakness, and cardiac arrhythmia. So you might be like, okay, why would we use these drugs anyway? You can actually use them if you monitor K plus levels regularly, and also if you use with thiazide diuretics, because thiazides also lower K plus levels. So to kind of compensate the high K plus caused by these three, you should give thiazides. And also make sure you monitor with ACE inhibitors and angiotensin 1 antagonists. So these symptoms of hyperkalemia, what are they? Vomiting, cramps, weakness, and cardiac arrhythmia can be caused by everything that blocks ENaC. What's that? So that's your aldosterone antagonists, such as spironolactone, these two, amiloride and triamterene, and also ACE inhibitors, such as ramipril. Ramipril stops angiotensin 2 forming, and angiotensin 2 normally activates aldosterone. So all these things basically lead, now obviously, so if you're inhibiting ACE, then you're inhibiting the formation of aldosterone, so you're basically inhibiting ENaC. If you're inhibiting ENaC, you're not going to get enough K plus being dumped out, which means you can get high K plus, so you can get vomiting, cramps, weakness, cardiac arrhythmia. So far, so good, not too bad. Okay, let's go. So this was our kind of summary of everything that's happening in the cortical collecting duct. There's now a bunch of diseases that I need to waffle about, so bear with me. The first one is called Liddle syndrome. And this occurs when your ENaC is naughty. It becomes overactive. So if your ENaC is overactive, a lot of salt is going to be reabsorbed. And obviously, these two are married. I'm going to keep repeating it so it's drummed into your head. If a lot of salt is being reabsorbed, K plus is being dumped out into the lumen. So you get hypokalemia, hypo with an O, and you get hypertension because you're getting high osmotic kind of pressure in your blood because you're getting a lot of salt. So oncotic pressure. Sorry, high oncotic pressure, not osmotic. There we go. So there's another disease here called Pseudohypoaldosteronism. That's a lot of letters, probably more than I can count to. But let's break it down. Hypoaldosteronism, so aldosterone means the thing that takes, transcribes this in order to get more salt. Hypo meaning low, so we're getting not enough salt being absorbed. Pseudo, what does pseudo mean? Pseudo means it appears to be like low aldosteronism, but it's not quite. So pseudo means that although aldosterone is actually normal in the body, or maybe raised, your body doesn't respond to it. So your mineral corticoid receptor will not be working basically as much. So although aldosterone is not effective itself, your cell can't respond to it, and that's kind of similar to like diabetes and insulin, right? If you think about it, it's not that there's no in type 2 diabetes. It's not that there's low insulin. It's that your body can't respond to it. So in this thing, despite the aldosterone, your cells won't be able to transcribe ENaC or ROMK. Hyperaldosteronism, you're not going to have as much ENaC and ROMK transcribed, and therefore you're not going to get K plus being dumped out into the lumen as much, so you're going to get high K plus. I don't think you need to worry about the sodium levels, but it can cause hyperkalaemia. Okay, now for our next disease, which is called diabetes insipidus. Wait, there's another type of diabetes. So diabetes, like diabetes mellitus and diabetes insipidus, diabetes means lots of wee. So mellitus was due to sugar, and insipidus is the other one, which is the one we're talking about now. Defects, basically diabetes insipidus occurs when there are defects in the water transport in the principal cells, which leads to loads of urine being produced. So yeah, okay. So there's two types of diabetes insipidus. One called nephrogenic. Nephrogenic means like genesis is coming from the nephron. So this disease comes from the nephron, from the kidney itself. And this is due to the basolateral V2 receptors, which are these ones here, which respond to ADH, being misfolded. So, or it can also be due to mutations in aquaporin 2. And it can also be due to damage to the kidney via lithium therapy, which you might be taking because of bipolar, for example. These kind of mutations that arise in the nephron mean that you can't respond to ADH. What does ADH do? ADH, anti-diuretic hormone, so it makes the urine less dilute, right? So it reabsorbs water, i.e. when you're dehydrated. Okay, I guess you can think of the DH in ADH as dehydrated. So your body, because this receptor will be mutated, or this might be mutated, won't be able to respond to ADH, so won't be able to take up water. So basically in your urine, you're going to get loads of water. So you get loads of watery wee. So this is called like polyuria. Now, because like, how would you treat this? You can't just give synthetic ADH because the receptor doesn't work, so it's not going to respond to it. Now, this is a bit techy, but you don't have to worry that they're antagonists. But you can give antagonists called tolvaptan, which is kind of an ADH antagonist basically, but essentially it works to help the V2 receptor. So it has a thing called a chaperone effect. Basically, it goes on and it's basically like more support for the V2 receptor, and it can kind of help the V2 receptor get made. And so by kind of expressing the V2 receptor more, you might be able to respond more to ADH. Again, so remember, the main symptom of diabetes insipidus is peeing a lot. Okay, now your second kind of cause of diabetes insipidus is going to be the same symptom, lots of wee, but this is due to pituitary surgery. And this basically happens, imagine you have a tumor in your head, in your pituitary gland, and a clumsy neurologist comes along and accidentally cuts out the bit of your pituitary gland that is responsible for making ADH. So now your body is not going to be able to make ADH. So would we be able to treat it with an ADH analog or not? We would be able to. Why? Because there's no problem with the receptors. So by giving fake ADH to help relieve this like weeing a lot, you can give a fake ADH called Desmopressin or something called carbamazepine as well. This could also occur due to head trauma, and you just may have a lack of ADH producing cells in the brain, so that might be congenital. But you can understand how essentially you get the same symptom, and this can either be caused within the nephron itself or centrally, i.e. from the brain. Okay, our next disease we're going to talk about is too much ADH. What does that mean? So ADH absorbs water from the blood, your dehydrated hormone. So this means lots of water from the blood is going to be reabsorbed. So this is going to mean that your urine is going to be very concentrated.
Master Skywalker, there are too many of them. What are we going to do?
So there we go. These are symptoms where you have too much ADH. Your first kind of cause that may cause too much ADH to happen is actually pregnancy. So pregnancy causes more ADH to be released for every given osmolality. So say your blood is, I don't know, 300 milliosmoles, right? Normally you'd release 1 unit of ADH. I'm just making these figures up. However, if you're pregnant, for that same 300 milliosmoles, you're now going to release 5 units, for example, instead. So pregnancy causes you to release more ADH. There's some graph. I don't really know what graph it is, but apparently it causes a left shift in the threshold of it. I think if you know the words that it causes a left shift, you'll be okay. Therefore, if more ADH is absorbed, remember this is the hormone that is made when you're dehydrated. Therefore, more water is reabsorbed when you're pregnant. What does that mean? It means that your blood osmolality can actually decrease because you're reabsorbing more water, and so your salt in your blood is going to become more diluted, more dissolved, so your osmolality will decrease by about 8 to 10 milliosmoles. You need to know that figure. Okay, this is another syndrome where you have too much ADH. Syndrome of inappropriate anti-diuresis. So anti-diuresis is the ADH thing, and it's abbreviated as SIADH. This occurs centrally when too much ADH is made from your pituitary gland, and it's found in people who are taking drugs, with severe disease, or in the elderly. It's very easy kind of what you do. So what's the symptom of this is that your blood can become diluted. Now, diluted blood, because you're absorbing more water into the blood. So that can mean your blood becomes diluted, which can cause essentially low sodium hyponatremia. And this low sodium can cause 2 problems: liver cirrhosis, so liver damage, and congestive heart failure. So you don't want your patient to have this. And kind of protect against the blood becoming too diluted, all you can do is a very simple therapy. You just restrict the amount of water so that there's less water to go through the aquaporin 2 and then the aquaporin 3 and then into the blood. If you restrict the amount of water in your diet, then your blood is going to become less dilute anyway. However, just this is something to be aware of. With the SIADH, you make sure you don't tell the patient to stop drinking water straight away, because your brain basically has a hissy fit. And it's like, oh snap, what's going on? I'm used to all this water, now there's no water. So essentially, a condition develops if you suddenly stop drinking water in the syndrome. You get a thing called central, so meaning in your brain. Pontine, pons is the back, like your back part of the brain. Myelin is the myelin sheath that lines the axon. Lysis, sorry. So your lysis of your myelin is being broken down. Basically, your pons, which is the back of the brain, has a hissy fit and then starts demyelinating. So the nerves become all messed up. If you cut water off like suddenly, so you've got to kind of grow gradually. You can also use ADH antagonists, because the whole thing of these syndromes is there's too much ADH being produced. So there's competitive antagonists called tolvaptan, which basically can decrease the amount of ADH and then basically inhibit this channel. So stopping water reabsorption. There's another one which is very similar to this, It's called nephrogenic. So this is the nephrogenic syndrome of inappropriate anti-diuresis. And this is when your V2 receptor gains function. So even if ADH isn't there, it's still going to be activated kind of all the time, which means that this is constantly expressed. Again, which means low amounts of urine will be made, and this can cause hyponatremia. With this one, you gradually just restrict the amount of water in the diet so the blood doesn't become diluted. So exactly the same thing. However, because this is not central, this isn't in the brain, the nephrogenic one isn't that fussy. So you can, I don't think it will cause central pontine myelinosis, if I remember correctly. So it's not as much of a problem, but you would just say gradually restrict the amount of water in the blood. Again, you can use competitive antagonists such as tolvaptan. So these antagonize ADH, meaning more water ends up urinated. Okay, we've finished all our stuff about the principal cells. We're now going to talk a little bit about the intercalating cells, which we said are responsible for the acid-base balance. Remember the alpha intercalating cells, the A is for acidic urine, so these secrete H plus into the lumen in exchange for K plus. And we said here, they do this deal with the devil thing. Basically, if there's too little K plus, they try to rectify that. But in order to do that, they have to dump out H plus into the lumen, which means that they cause metabolic alkalosis. So here's your epithelial cell again, your lumen, and your basolateral side. And within this, if you watch the PCT video, this will kind of make sense how acid is kind of dealt with in the cells. So you have a cell which is in the cytosol, so cytosolic is carbonic anhydrase. What it does, it takes carbon dioxide and H2O and works them together to make something called carbonic acid. And obviously, acid dissociates, as you remember from chemistry A level, into H plus and HCO3 minus, so bicarbonate. And this is kind of going to diffuse on both membranes. So in your H plus, this is in your alpha cells, which are also in your cortical collecting duct, is going to diffuse firstly via one channel. It's going to be actively pumped out via something called the V-type ATPase. So ATPase is actively pumping it. H plus active dumper outer, basically. So that's one way of H plus getting out. And your second one is called your gastric, so it's the same one found in your stomach, H plus ATPase. Why is it found in the stomach? Oh yeah, because we secrete acid into the stomach. So this takes H plus, this pumps H plus out in exchange for K plus. This is the one that causes problems. Basically, okay, in a nutshell, imagine you've got low K plus all of a sudden because you've been taking a drug, for example, such as furosemide. Okay, now this low K plus is your kidney wants to rectify this, so it's going to take in K plus here. But to deal with the devil, in order to do that, it has to pump H plus out here, which means that in order to do that, you're getting rid of acid, which means that you're getting more alkaline in your blood, so you can get metabolic alkalosis. On your basolateral membrane of your alpha intercalating cells, you have your HCO3 minus channel, and you also have a chloride channel that it kind of works together with. So this is an antiporter, and it kind of deposits HCO3 on the basolateral membrane. And you also have a chloride channel, kind of a lone chloride channel that pumps out chloride. So chloride kind of gets recycled on the basolateral side. And no ATP is required for this antiporter. Okay, so if we think back to Gittelman's disease, this stops NCC salt reabsorption. So Gittelman's disease was in the distal convoluted tubule, and it's going to stop NCC salt reabsorption. So basically, this syndrome is mutations in your NCC channel, so you're going to get less salt. In order to try and get more salt, your collecting duct is like, okay, I want more salt. How do I get that? That's, remember, through the ENaC and ROMK channels that come about via aldosterone. But if you're getting more salt via ENaC, then remember these two are married. More salt means that you have to dump out more K plus. into the lumen. So ROMK dumps K plus out, which means that in order to compensate for the skittlements by taking up more salt, you end up dumping K plus out into your urine, which can cause hyperkalemia. Right, so now we've got another problem. So problem 2, we've got hyperkalemia. So your kidney is like, okay, I can correct this by taking in more K plus so that we have more K plus for the body. But again, the deal with the devil thing is that in order to take K plus in, it needs to pump H plus out. So H plus is pumped out onto the luminal membrane, causing metabolic alkalosis. So this is basically what we just said. K plus, the collecting duct tries to take more K plus in to correct with this thing here, this hyperkalemia, which was caused also by the collecting duct ENaC cells, transporters in your principal cells. In order to get more K plus, it has to pump more H plus into the lumen, i.e. the urine becomes more acidic, which means the blood becomes more alkaline because there's not enough H plus to go around in the blood, which can cause metabolic alkalosis. So this is what we were saying here. This channel here, this gastric type H-ATPase, is responsible for causing quite a few problems. So in the thick ascending limb, you have something called Bartter syndrome, which is mutations in ROMK, NKCC2, and your TALH, or your CLC-KB-Barton. All these have the same effect of basically breaking the NKCC2 channel, which means they cause the loss of sodium. Okay, so now there's a loss of sodium in your thick ascending limb. What's going to happen? It's exactly the same thing. Your ENaC wants to kind of correct for this in your principal cells, but in order to do that, it has to dump out K plus. This causes hyperkalemia, blah blah. You get the idea. And this is exactly the same thing with furosemide. So furosemide can also cause metabolic alkalosis because it stops the TALH from absorbing sodium by the NKCC2. The kidney tries to correct this, but in order to do that, it has to dump out K plus. Then we get hyperkalemia, and in order to correct for that, you get metabolic alkalosis, and you also get the same thing with thiazides, and you also get the same thing with hyperaldosteronism, which is a brand new disease. So hyperaldosteronism occurs when you have too much aldosterone being secreted. This means that your principal cells reabsorb more sodium and more water because they're expressing more ENaC. Remember, where salt goes, water follows. So more water is also being reabsorbed. And this leads to something called chronic expansion of plasma volume. So because you're absorbing more salt, the water is going to kind of follow through. So your plasma volume can increase dramatically. Therefore, in response, your body will decrease ADH because it's like, I'm not dehydrated anymore. But because you've now absorbed a lot of sodium, this can cause hyper with an ER, natremia, so too much sodium in the blood. So you have your beta-intercalating cells, which are now your last cells in your cortical collecting duct. You have your epithelium here, and your lumen, and your basolateral membrane, where the blood is. Your main job of your beta-intercalating cells is to make your urine basic. So the main channel here is a HCO3 minus channel, which allows bicarbonate to diffuse outwards. And it takes 2Cl minus up instead. And you also have this other channel, which takes up, the main thing you need to know about this channel is it takes up a little bit of sodium. So you do get some sodium reabsorption. You get your free Cl minus kind of channel here, which is your Barton one. So B is for basic urine, small amount of sodium reabsorption, and the main thing is it dumps H2O3 minus into the urine. Again, that's your basolateral CLC KB Barton. So Barton is a subunit that helps that channel out. And there's also a V-type ATPase, which dumps H plus out on this side onto the basolateral membrane. This kind of makes sense. If you have HCO3 minus on this side, you'll need H plus going out on the other side. Now, these cells are not targeted by diuretics. However, because they're not targeted by diuretics and they take up a little bit of sodium here, say you have a diuretic, say for example furosemide, this is still going to take up some sodium. So the point of the diuretic is to stop sodium reabsorption, but because of these beta intercalating cells, you're still going to kind of have some sodium reabsorption, so these kind of slightly counter the effects of diuretics.